So welcome today to this session, Regenerative Carbon Farming 101, which is part of the Sustainability Festival in the Bass Coast. My name is Zoe Geyer. I'm the coordinator of Totally Renewable Phillip Island. And we have a aim or mission of being carbon neutral by 2030. And coincidentally, I'm side by side with Bhavani, who was a former coordinator for Totally Renewable. So talk about shoes to fill. So Bhavani will be presenting today on regenerative carbon farming, but before we do kick off, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Bunurong people, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge that these lands were never ceded. And on that note, I will hand over, while we're talking about healing, reconciliation and regeneration, I'll hand over to Bhavani to explain to us what is involved. Thanks, Bhavani.
Thanks, Zoe. Welcome, everyone. I know all of you, but Jan anyway, and so it's nice to meet you, Jan. Myself, I was coordinator of Totally Renewable Phillip Island when it first began and for the first 2 years, and now I have dropped back to being the head of the carbon regenerative carbon group, along with Bob Davey, who is also here. My history is I've been on the island over 20 years, brought up both my kids here, and although I've got no scientific background into regenerative carbon farming, I'm very passionate. My background is in health, and what I have discovered across the period of learning about regenerative carbon farming is that in fact it's very similar to our own body health. You can look at the two quite similarly. So I'll get my slideshow going. So regenerative carbon farming. My definition of it is it's a method of sustainable farming practices that help to increase the health of the soil as well as the whole farm. So with this, the idea is you're working in harmony with nature. The defined approach to the actual definition is it's a conservation and rehabilitation approach to food and farming systems. It focuses on soil regeneration, increasing biodiversity, improving the water cycle, enhancing the ecosystem, supporting carbon sequestration, increasing resilience to climate change, and strengthening the health and vitality of the farm. That's why I had my own definition, because I found that one quite a mouthful, but we are going to look at all those components of the definition. Just taking a step back, in the last group that we just had, which was actually on the carbon cycle, Tim went into what is carbon and why we need it. And this is just looking quickly back at that cycle, which just goes through and says that carbon is a natural element and a necessary element. It is actually the building block of all of life, and it's balance. Carbon is in balance in our on our planet, until us as humans came along and got clever at using carbon for our own purposes. So we began to pull out carbon from the ground, and we used it for our advantage into fossil fuels. We farmed, that also added a carbon effect, and that turned into CO2, which became like a polar fleece blanket across the top of our planet. And so as sunlight came in, a lot is reflected back out, but with our increasing CO2 in the atmosphere, what happens is more is staying in, and it creates a warming effect. The effect we're calling climate change, and this is defined as a change in pattern of weather, which with related changes in the ocean, land surfaces and ice sheets. And this occurs over time, but is currently happening so fast as to be quite a negative effect. So you might hear people talk about, but there's always ups and downs in the weather patterns, and which is true, but the effects are happening at a much accelerated speed. What I'm going to focus on, which is the regenerative carbon farming side, is this drawdown. So it's the side of trying to draw the CO2 or the carbon dioxide back down into and under into the soil and under the Earth's surface. So we're trying to remove that excess CO2 from the atmosphere, and that's commonly been referred to as a legacy load. So there is a constant putting up of CO2 and a pulling down, but over the last 200 years, we've been putting up at a much faster rate than pulling down. And this is called a drawdown process. There is a book that's been produced called Drawdown by Paul Hawken, which is a very interesting book to read. And it's got 80 solutions, the top 80 solutions that we need to do to help pull down this CO2. And number 11 is regenerative agriculture. I'll clear up a little bit of confusion that can happen. So there's soil carbon and there's carbon dioxide. Soil carbon is the carbon element that is stored in the ground. Carbon dioxide is the carbon element in gas form that is in the atmosphere. So people refer to a ton of carbon emissions, and that often is referring to a ton of CO2, and it's often got an E on the end, and that just means equivalent. So the CO2 equivalent is carbon dioxide equivalent, meaning the equivalent to a ton of carbon emissions. The term carbon will also crop up in phrases like carbon footprint, which describes your total amount of greenhouse gases. And in Tim's last lecture, he talked about all the different greenhouse gases, and carbon dioxide is one of them. But that's what we're talking about mainly today. So it can be a mix of the gases as well when you're talking about carbon footprint, but often it is mainly referring to CO2. What we're going to talk about in terms of carbon is we want to look at, once we've drawn down the carbon dioxide into the soil to make it carbon in the ground. So the best known way to effectively draw down CO2 into soil carbon is a natural way, funnily enough. It's photosynthesis. So this is the safest way and the most effective and quickest way to get CO2 back into the ground. Technology now is allowing scientists to develop other ways. I think there is a vacuum that they actually can vacuum the mixed of gases in and hold the CO2 and store it deep down. But the natural effective way is photosynthesis. And this is putting carbon back down into the soil, and we'll often refer to this as good carbon. But photosynthesis is a natural process of plants, and it's a process that converts light energy into chemical energy, which is later used by the plant to fuel its activities. The chemical energy that is transformed from the CO2 that it draws down is stored as carbohydrate molecules, which the plant converts into sugars. And this, sorry, I've got the photos of it, whatever, the pictures of all our people in my way of my own slide. And that comes from carbon dioxide and water to make these sugars. The sugars are used by the plants as energy, and they take it down into the root. And at this point, the root plants rely on the microbes in the soil to work in conjunction with their own systems. And that will also transfer from the roots of the plants into the soil. The microorganisms will then turn that into carbon as it builds soils. I was just reading the Diggers magazine. It wasn't this one, but that was the best picture I could get. That just arrived, I don't know, about a week ago. And every article in that magazine was on regenerative carbon farming. So it's coming at us at all angles. Just in the newspaper the last few days, Heather was just commenting on Landline. It's out there coming at us from every direction, this idea of regenerative carbon farming or sequestering carbon. There's many ways to look at it. But one of the biggest things that caught my eye was that we've got to stop treating our soil like dirt. So we stop calling it dirt and we start calling it soil. Because it's the health of the soil. And this is where I flick back to being from the health industry, allied health industry, and I can look at soil and say it's just like our gut. And you know, more recently in terms of human health, we've got right into gut health and gut bacteria. And even in the medical model now, if you go on antibiotics, they will suggest that you actually have your probiotics to help your gut heal after the antibiotics, to increase your gut bacteria. So soil is very like our own guts. So the microorganisms in the soil, which is the bacteria and the fungi, they're vital to the health of the soil. It's all about balance again. Even ads on TV for your probiotics talk about the balance of the bacteria in the gut, and the soil is exactly the same. It's all about the balance. You must have the microorganisms and the fungi to allow the plants to enable them to fully use the photosynthate and the carbohydrate and sugars that they transform from the CO2. So the plants need their bacteria just like we need our bacteria. When you keep doing false additives or taking from the land, that strips the soil bare. So it's time that we have to start looking at replenishing the soil and get the soil healthy so that it can grow great food for us. There's a lot more talk about fungi and bacteria and the humble mushroom. There's a book which I'll show you the title of coming up, which talks about the fungi will save our earth, will be our savior. So mycelium is a massive branch like thread-like branches, and it's like a spider's web through the soil. The mycelium are parts of the fungi that will stretch from one plant to another and create communication between plants, between fungi and bacteria. And they're now beginning to understand that these spider thread-likes, the communication between the plants are not only in terms of just communication about what's going on, but it will actually transfer nutrients. So a deeper rooted plant may well feed a shallower rooted plant during a period of drought. It will also transfer information that as a pest infestation might occur, it will begin to let other plants around know about this pest infestation, and those plants can then begin having their own mechanisms ready to repel the pest. So the mycelium is a primary factor in the plant's health for nutrient uptake and growth and communication. And the increasing knowledge that we're getting about fungi and the plants are leading to and will continue to lead to new ways of farming. This is a picture of what mycelium may look like under the microscope. You don't see this, obviously, when you pull up a clump of dirt, but it is in there. Mycelium Running is the book by Paul Stamets called How the Mushroom Can Save the World. And I've recently got it. I haven't worked my way through it, but it's a beautiful book on understanding fungi and the importance of it within our farming life. Carbon farming versus regenerative farming. They can be the same, but they're not always exactly the same. Carbon farming is solely about, we're talking about getting carbon into the ground in the fastest possible way. For example, you might add a chemical fertilizer like nitrogen to help maximize the growth and the breakdown of dry matter. But over time, using the chemical, this may lead to an outer balance within the soil. And it's still based on our historical premise of taking rather than living in harmony. So it's not necessarily regenerative because it may not continue to last over longer periods. Regenerative farming looks at a method of sustainable farming practices that can help to increase the health of the soil. Tries to work in harmony with nature rather than against. So in the example of nitrogen, regenerative farmers may plant peas, for example, which will help pull nitrogen into the surrounding soil, and then these peas are mulched back into that soil, therefore creating greater carbon levels. And this becomes a more sustainable way, so you're not adding anything that's not natural. Excuse me. Regenerative carbon farming methods, there's 6 steps generally accepted for this. One is the minimal soil disturbance, so not tilling the soil to allow the continual growth of the microbiology within the soil. And you can imagine, if you think back to the slide on the mycelia, that if each time you turn a clump of earth over, you're exposing all the deeper fungi and the mycelium, and that will dry out and die. And so you're creating death of those bacteria and fungi each time you turn it over. It's almost sort of like us after a storm when the internet goes down, you know, there's no communication. So we don't know what to do. So we're trying to keep that communication within the soil going. So minimal disturbance. Maximize the crop diversity within the pasture or the crop species. So having greater diversity in the crops on the surface of the soil leads to greater diversity within the roots. This leads to a better health of fungi and bacteria diversity as well, and better communications. So pasture diversity can just be simply having different crop pastures growing within the same paddock, and crop species is rather than having massive fields of, say, wheat growing, they're trying to look at smaller farms having lines of different crop growing. This also can help with pests. So if you have one species of crop growing and you get a pest, it will go through the entire crop. Whereas if you have crop species and different lines of crops, then it's not going to affect the entire different crops within that one paddock. Number 3, keep the soil covered at all times. So you're trying to create no areas of bare earth. Again, bare earth, if you imagine the biological activity within the earth, you've got compaction happening where there's bare earth, you've got it drying out. Less water is going in because of the compaction, and the water holding ability of that soil decreases. So with compaction, with less water and with less roots, that part of the soil becomes a lot deader in its microbiology. Living roots all year round. So the idea with this is to keep the soil alive with the root system in it. If you've got plants you no longer want, often it's with regenerative farming, it would be about mowing the top of the soil, or having animals come in and eat, top of the crop off, or having animals come in and eat some of the crop, but leaving the roots in the ground there to die. So that, well, for 2 reasons. One, some will die off and create passages for water and for new roots to grow, and others, some of them will actually regenerate and regrow. So it allows, that living root will allow a quicker next generation of plant to grow. And if we think back to photosynthesis, 70% of the photosynthate will go into the root system. So mulching or allowing animals come in and eat the top of the plants work a lot better than turning plants over to kill the root system if you were wanting to plant a new crop. Manage livestock. The idea here is have a third part of your pasture would be eaten by the animals, a third is trampled, and a third remains there for rapid regrowth. The trampled parts, you've got the broken stems and they die and they become mulch, and then that turns into carbon as well. And then you've got integration of trees and shrubs. Growing the trees and the shrubs are a deeper rooted plant. Here you can create shelter belts or tree clusters around pastures that are going to have animals in them. Having the shelter belts allows a shade which can reduce water consumption of the animals. It also allows for wind protection. It not only reduces, if you had a crop growing next to trees, it reduces the water consumption of the crop itself because it creates its own climate with the shade and the shelter. Just seeing that I got everything there. Mycelium go down. They've found mycelium down as long as 2 meters and deeper, so they follow the roots all the way down. So having deep rooted next to shallow rooted just keeps that whole health of the soil going. What regenerative carbon farming achieves for the land. So soil health improves, nutrients come back into balance, and then they're available for the plant use. Pasture and crops are healthier and lead to healthier animals. And this all leads to increased soil carbon. Water retention improves. So as soil increases in carbon, the water retention improves with that. So your soil becomes more drought resistant and flood tolerant. For 1% increase in total organic carbon, there's an increase of 120,000 to 160,000 litres of water retention per hectare. So that is quite dramatic. And even across these last few months, how we've seen our weather change, that need for both drought and flood tolerant is very important. The microbiology increases of bacteria and fungi in the soil will cause increase in water retention and increase in soil nutrients. And coming back to that idea of the gut, our gut being similar to soil, it's again, you've got to have a live system of bacteria working in balance with the nutrients, with the root system, and everything works together. And of course, what we were looking at, what it's doing in terms of climate change, is it's removing the CO2 from the atmosphere. What regenerative carbon farming achieves for the farm. There's an increase in organic matter and a soil buildup. There's a reduction of costs, so there's no more need to buy fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides. There is, of course, sometimes transitional costs that need to be considered, but we're looking at the longer term effect of it all. An increase in yield production. They've done studies to show that with diversity you can get an increase in yield production. There's been many articles to show that the bigger monoculture farms were increasing their costs of pesticides and herbicides, and yet each year their yield production was going down. Generally speaking, the animals are healthier because they're getting a diverse diet. So with the diversity in the pasture, the animals too get a diverse diet for their guts. So their guts become healthier. There's a reduction of water needs, both from the plants and the animals, and based on the root diversity and protection from larger plants. More diversity within the plants themselves, within the animals, so the birds and the native animals that coexist within farms, and within the insect population. And all this diversity leads to a reduction of pest infestation. It's a happier and healthier farm, and a happier and healthier farmer. And we can ask Bob that later, because he's one of them. There's general farmer well-being. As their farm improves in health, the farmer is happier. And it's a change in our thinking. It's a longer term thinking for our future, with climate change as a basis to that, and thinking about our future and our kids' future. So what are we doing locally with regenerative farming? December 19, TRPI, in conjunction with Landcare, with the support of Bob and Anne at Bimbadeen, were able to have a carbon auction, and we added 5 farms to get soil carbon tested to 1 meter's depth. We are following up with that this December or January, just depending on how moist the soil is, to find out what's going on. That I'm aware, and Bob might be able to correct me on this, I think there's about 8 properties that have been tested on the island for soil carbon. So we're slowly getting a picture of what the island is made up of, and what our ability is to sequester carbon into it. 2021, we've been working with Landcare to establish the Island Bush Carers, and we're launching that. I'm mentioning it today, but on November 13th at 12:30 online, we're having a online launch of that. There are 2 programs that are available, which is a plant a day, and Heather Davidson has experienced the benefit to that because her farm got some plants this year for a plant a day. And then there's a voluntary carbon offset, and we've had our first customer for that. Locally speaking, our Landcare over the years have been doing a great job with getting more plants going. And this is Bill Cleland's farm in Surf Beach. It's the east-west corridor, and 2018, you can see the plants have not long gone in, and 2020 and how they're looking. So I've just got some photos of farms to have a look at. Richie and Sharon Davies farm in Ventnor. It's a shelter belt on Hurricane Hill. 2018 went in, and the trees are going well 2 years later. So, and that's a really windy spot. So to have a nice shelter belt there is going to do really well for the pastures and the animals. Kim plants. She has 20 acres at Forest Cave, and her goal now is to give this 20 acres back to nature and plant out the whole area. We started with, I think it was 2,500 plants this year went in. So you can see it's a flood prone area, and it's a salt area because the ocean's just over the sand dunes at the back there. So, you can see how bare this ground is, and hopefully in a few years' time, how lush it will be. Helen Henderson's in Rills. She's done a lot of regenerative stuff as well on her farm. And these are 3 areas that were in 2013 were direct seeded. So that means the seeds went down rather than tube stock, but there was follow-up tube planting for any gaps, and they've done amazingly well. This is my place, Rooks Little Farm. So we arrived here 2 years ago to an empty paddock. It had been part of the dairy farm. And so everything we've done on this is just 2 years old, and we've used regenerative and permaculture methods to increase soil health and the carbon. So we've done things like planting a wood crop. The animals we have are alpacas, and we've done shelter belts. We're on the crest of a hill and we get a lot of wind. So we've done a lot of shelter belts. We've done cottage garden, and we've put dams in and done a lot of planting around dams. This is just the launching of the bush care again in partnership with Landcare. So as I say, on Saturday, this Saturday at 12:30 if you want to listen to that for the 2 methods. So Island Bush Carers, the Voluntary Carbon Offset Program, Deb Ladden, came to me this year. She was actually the one that pushed me into finalising the whole program by saying that she did want to offset her business, which is Leonard and Associates. And so I found an online carbon calculator, which she did, and she found easy to use. And she found that her business emitted 7 tonnes of carbon. So the plants at the moment, what we're doing is costing out per plant and guard, and that's $2 per plant. So she decided she'd pay double because she was feeling so good about this. And she now plans to offset her home, and she's on the San Remo Kinder committee, and they're planning to offset to become carbon neutral. And it's a yearly process because you do it once. It's not just a one-off. The Island Bush Care, the second program, or the other program, is a tree a day, and this is Heather Davidson who with us, and this is her plantings that went on this year, and that was from Kelly from our Lux Clothing, and she did 365 plants basically, so for a plant a day, and they were done in August, and then 2 months later you can see growth happening, so that's exciting. Bob and Anne, and Bob's with us today. Their story is tomorrow at 12:30, and they've been a member of Landcare from way back when, I think it was even before. Was it only 2002, Bob? I thought it was earlier. But anyway, you've been travelling the regenerative carbon story for a while, and on average, it's 1,200 tonne of CO2 equivalent per year storing in their soils and their trees. And he's got a great story to tell about the methods that he's been used. And he was inspirational in my regenerative carbon story indeed. What can you do? You can look at your life. You can assess and maybe do a carbon emissions audit. You can look after plants. You can plant more plants. You can get involved in community groups, become an island bush carer. You can understand the role of politics and use your vote accordingly. Recently, there was a great thing on ABC called The Big Deal that allowed me personally to understand politics a lot more and actually have a bit more of a want to maintain an involvement and use my vote better. And just remembering that from all small things, big things can be achieved. And that's it. So I will stop my share and we can come back into chat.
Bhavani, that's absolutely amazing. I think, you know, the more time I've spent with you, the more I am very interested in doing something similar to what you've been doing. So thank you for showing the way. But I don't want to hog the stage. So does anyone, Jan, did you want to ask anything while we've got a captive audience here?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the presentation. It feels a bit random. I live in Surf Coast, and I'm not a farmer. I'm not on big acreage either, but I'm sort of obviously interested in carbon sequestration, and was involved with a group doing biochar workshops and this kind of stuff. So, but I am interesting. I was wondering, given that it's called carbon farming, and personally, I'm sort of sitting more on the nature conservation side, being involved with Victorian National Parks Association, and generally, like biodiversity offsetting is it's bullshit in my books, but carbon offsetting is interesting, and I was just wondering about sort of the policy landscape, what's happening in that space, you know, and you mentioned land care initiatives, and if that would become a more formal process, or is this more like, you know, a community?
So you're asking about carbon offsets using plants as opposed to soil. So why we've looked at using plants and working with Landcare at this stage, and it is a voluntary program, is because being the island and where all our farms here are smaller, and to go into the government, GMFs were all too difficult. And Bob will certainly be able to talk more to that, because he's looked at it a lot more in depth and understands it better than I do. But you need a lot more space to create, to make it worthwhile, because soil testing itself is expensive. However, at the same time, what's happening is for people who have to offset, the amount per tonne of carbon equivalent to offset is actually going up. So it used to be $12, now it's hovering more around the $25. In Europe, it's more like the 100, equivalent to $100 per tonne. So as that changes, it might become more profitable to actually, for small farms to do. But for now, what we've looked at is that quite potentially it's the council have a goal to revegetate the island with a grand goal of 30%. And so if we can work to help that, and in the process, people want to do something, we've found, so that we're looking at the voluntary idea of you know, a small business, like the business who did the voluntary offset. She's an office. She has no legal requirement to offset. She's doing it because she wants to do it. And there's a lot of people who want to do that. So, and a lot of people want to be able to see where it's going. So rather than paying an anonymous group that may do something or may spend a lot of your money in costs to do a little, you know, you pay a local voluntary group, and you can go and put your own plants in the ground with that group, and then you can drive past that farm and you can see the plants growing. So we're not saying it's going to go on public land. There'll be a mixture of public and private land that it goes on to, but it's just about getting trees in the ground and being voluntary. We don't really have, there's not the long-term contract or commitment created, and we haven't even gone into that idea of down the track. We're just looking at now, if we can get plants in the ground now, it's better. We're trying to keep it as simple as possible, because the moment you go down the difficult questions, you won't do it, and then plants don't get in the ground. So it's based a lot on trust and community.
And so is Landcare helping with the brokering of the relationships, or is this Lauren talks to you and you work something out, or what's, so is there a bit of a formalized process around it?
Well, we work in partnership anyway with TRPI works in partnership with Landcare anyway, and so often our people are mixed in with their group as well, so we all kind of double up. And what we're doing is promoting it through both our groups and through the website, and then people will come to us and we'll talk to them individually. I don't believe we'll be that flooded with requests that I wouldn't be able to talk to each person individually. So yeah, we keep it on a community level and a local, you know, knowledge level. Does that help?
Yeah. I'm sort of rather new to that. So I have looked into biodiversity offsetting more, and I'm also wondering if on a federal level, maybe the policy landscape will change.
And it's kind of, I think it will change. And but what we decided is we didn't want to wait for it to change, because people are keen to do something, and somebody who lives in an urban area does want to do more, but they can't on their own piece of land. But it also, what we've found in our community, we've got the landholders, the farmers, and then we've got the urban group, and there is a disconnect between them. So if we can bring them together, and Landcare with their plantings do that beautifully, because we use volunteers to go out plants, and you get to be on a property that you don't normally get to be on. You get to talk to the property owner and the farmer, and you get to listen to their story a bit, and it just creates that understanding between the two sectors. So yeah.
And I think I'll just before I moved to the island, which was a year and a half ago, I went through the process with my own business back in Melbourne of doing a carbon assessment through auditors and doing the formalised process to have certification as carbon neutral. But unfortunately, because of the scale of my business being so small and having such a small carbon footprint, to offset it, the only available way I could do that within those official parameters was to purchase part of a wind power set up in India. So the idea of being able to contribute to your local area on a very small personal scale and then watch it grow, I think is, we talk a lot at TRPI about like having visibility over your actions. And I think the closer you are to it and the more you can see and touch and feel and be aware that there is change through your choices, then I think the more empowered and positive we are in making a difference and a contribution.
Yeah, and I'd agree with that too. And that's the direction we've gone for, is that your geographical location. So initially we've been calling it insetting, and it being because it's inset within your own geographical, and it's an official term, but people don't recognize it that well. So just calling it a voluntary offset has also worked. And because people understand offset because it's in the news, it's talked about, things like that. So yeah. So, you know, we're only launching it now. We've had inquiries. We have done some soil testing as well, and we will get the results of our second, so 2 years down the track, and we'll be able to sit with those 5 farmers to look at what's happened, what worked, what didn't work, what went up, what didn't go up, and maybe get an idea. But yeah, otherwise we're looking at more of the using the vegetation for it.
How much does the soil testing cost?
Well, for us, it's about $500 per paddock, and you generally take 5 tests per paddock. Now, you can make your paddock as greater area or as small area as you want. It just depends how precise. So you could call a whole farm of 300 acres one paddock. You're just going to get a very much an average in that. So it depends what you need and want.
And do you always go like a meter deep, or
yeah, well, the government standards are a meter, so we decided if we stuck with that, because it does vary over the meter significantly, and if you're just going the top 10 to 20 centimeters, that is the newer carbon put into, and you want to know that you're getting carbon deeper as well. But I think that's based on the government regulation, so if we stick with what they're doing, then if at any time we need to jump over into government regulation stuff, or it becomes available to us, then we're already done the tests.
And are you using biochar, or is this something?
Now Bob is, but I'm personally not. But Bob is, and he's done some studies. So
Bob isn't.
Oh,
Bob isn't.
Oh, I thought you would. No,
we haven't used any biochar.
Okay, no, Bob's not. I'm not.
Bob might. To determine, you know, how much carbon you can get into a paddock.
I've gone for the what can I do that is available without too much expense, and to me, biochar with another expense. So I've only got 5 acres, so I'm a little farm, and so yeah, which also means I can do a lot more hands-on stuff. I appreciate when you have hundreds of acres, you can't be quite so hands-on to every acre. So yeah.
Fantastic. Well, I think that was very fascinating, Bhavani. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
We're pretty much right on time. So unless there's any other questions from anyone out there, we might call that a day. And I will just mention as well that what we're recording will be available on the TRPI YouTube channel at some point down the track when I get a bit organised. So I think it's just going to be amazing having some resources to refer back to as well. So thank you all for coming along today. And Bhavani, thank you for your time in particular and your expertise.
Pleasure.
And yeah, we'll no doubt see you all at another presentation soon.
Saturday afternoon.
Or tomorrow, in
and
fact.
Bob tomorrow.
And
Yeah.
fantastic. Thanks, everyone. See you.
Cool.